Close your eyes. Now, imagine a single room. The fire has burned low, leaving just a faint orange glow. 10 people, kids, grandparents, maybe a maid, and even a goat are all crammed into one room. It's quiet but not private. There are no walls, no doors, no blankets to hide under, just straw on the floor and the sound of breathing all around. Somewhere in that dark, a husband reaches for his wife, slowly, carefully, because even though they're married, there's no such thing as being alone. So how did love survive in a world where privacy didn't exist? Where could intimacy hide when desire whispered louder than shame, but space was shared by all? Here's the reality: most medieval homes didn't have rooms plural. What we'd call a room today was often the entire house. One boxy space made of wood or, in colder regions, stone and turf, with a central fire pit and a hole in the roof for smoke. That was it. That was the house. According to 13th century land records, most English peasants lived in these one-room structures, often referred to as open halls. Probate inventories from the time don't list multiple beds or separate chambers. They show one bed, shared by all, as completely normal, not an exception. Night and day blended together. A bench at noon became a sleeping spot by night. Children slept under the same covers as their parents. And in the brutal winters, families didn't just huddle close for affection, they did it to survive. There was no privacy, not even enough room to stretch your legs. And yet, this is where marriage played out, where couples tried to find each other emotionally and physically under the weight of constant eyes and ears. Marriage didn't come with a honeymoon suite, it came with company. Even the wedding night wasn't private. In some communities, people literally watched. Ceremonial customs around bedding the bride and groom often involve witnesses, escorting the couple to bed just to confirm consummation. Romantic, right? But for most, intimacy wasn't ceremonial, it was obstructed. In 14th century Yorkshire, court records tell of a woman who lay with her husband behind the bread oven because their family home had no other space. In Essex, a servant testified that she overheard her master and mistress nightly separated only by a flimsy hanging cloth. Sexual relations were expected in marriage, yet they had to be timed perfectly, hidden cleverly, or endured silently. Parents would wait until their children drifted off. Some waited for market days when the house emptied out. Others didn't wait at all. The church preached that the marriage debt had to be paid regularly. So many couples did what they could. Blankets pulled up, voices low, moving quietly with the unspoken understanding that someone else was always listening. In one sense, love was never alone. In another, it was never free. So what do you do when you can't build a wall? You hang a curtain. Timber was expensive. Stone was cold. But fabric? Fabric became the medieval version of a do not disturb sign. These weren't delicate drapes. They were thick, rough, unpatched woolen cloths, sometimes lined with fur, hung across beams or nailed into rafters. They didn't muffle sound, but they gave the illusion of space. And sometimes, illusion was enough. Even a thin cloth could mean everything. It gave couples a place to change, to touch, to whisper without facing 10 sets of eyes. By the 15th century, wealthier peasants began listing bed curtains in their household inventories right alongside tools and cooking pots. It was proof, even then, privacy mattered. In townhouses, apprentices might all sleep together in one loft, but the master and his wife, they got the curtain bed. The four-poster bed with heavy drapes became more than a place to sleep. It became a private little world, a space where breath and touch could belong to just two people. In a world where everything was shared, privacy wasn't a right. It was a creative act. Intimacy had to be planned. Couples learned to read the rhythms of the house: when the baby was finally asleep, when the neighbors were at market, when the fire had died low and footsteps outside had faded. Silence became a tool, a signal, even a kind of promise. Words were risky, but a glance across the room at dusk, that could be enough. Some couples left signals for each other, a turned up shoe, a lantern in a certain spot to say, now, or wait, or not tonight. In homes with servants, someone might pretend to be ill to send the others away. Tasks became opportunities. Go fetch water, feed the goats, tend the fire. And just maybe for a short while, the room would be theirs. If not, they'd sneak away, out behind the barn, near the grain sacks, next to the chicken coop. Not glamorous, but real. Because even stolen moments were better than none. Winter brought long, dark nights. Darkness fell early. The house quieted sooner. People slept longer. And in that deep hush, while frost crept along the window and the world held its breath, some couples found their chance. There were no doors to lock, no do not disturb signs, just a tiny flickering moment of privacy. Just enough. And if you think class didn't play a role here, it absolutely did. For the poor, that one-room home was everything. It was the whole world. They had no spare chambers, no spare beds. They didn't even have the option of privacy. But for wealthier families, minor lords, rising merchants, prosperous yeomen, privacy became a status symbol. By the late medieval period, some homes began to feature a solar and upstairs room meant for sleeping, away from the public hall. The lord and lady could retreat there, maybe even lock a door, maybe even enjoy a chimney, a real bed, and something that resembled peace. Inventories from 14th century Kent show rooms with linen sheets, wooden chests for personal items, and separate beds. Meanwhile, the cotter and his wife still curled up beside the fire with the baby crying nearby. Even in monasteries and nunneries, where intimacy was strictly forbidden, we still find stories of hidden corners and whispered sins. Even in castles, yes, castles' walls were thin. Servants listened. Gossip spread. Privacy was never guaranteed. It was always scaled. It was earned. It was bought. When you had money, you could afford silence. But what happens when even curtains and careful timing aren't enough? You leave the house. Many couples, especially young lovers or those not yet married, sought privacy where no one lived. Out in barns, in empty bakehouses, behind the mill, or at the forest's edge. These places were cold, rough, exposed to the elements, but they offered something precious: solitude. Church records from across medieval Europe tell us a lot, not just about sin and scandal, but about desperation. Desperate for connection, desperate for even a moment to be together. There are documented cases of couples caught near the stables or under trees, fined or whipped, or publicly shamed for what the church called acts of flesh. But these weren't random lustful affairs. They were often the only chance couples had to be alone. Behind hedges, under moonlight, in haylofts. This was the medieval version of sneaking out after dark. And for married couples, it wasn't sin. It was survival. When your house was bursting with people, noise, and chores, and when you had no room of your own, sometimes love had to go out into the cold to find space. One record from 15th century Norfolk describes a couple who laid together on a sack of wheat behind the granary while their home was packed with guests. Nothing fancy, nothing planned, but a quiet, human moment carved out of the chaos. And that's what makes these stories quietly remarkable. In a world that offered so little space for privacy, every act of intimacy became an act of resistance against noise, judgment, structure, and shame. Something as small as reaching for a partner in the dark became a kind of defiance, a refusal to let love be completely crushed by circumstance. But love in the Middle Ages wasn't just a matter of timing and location, it was also about surveillance. Everyone was watching. And the people watching often had power. The church had a lot to say about sex. A lot. Not much about love, but sex, constant commentary. Within marriage, intimacy was allowed, even expected, but only for one purpose: procreation. If you weren't trying to have children, desire was seen as suspicious. Lust, even within a marriage, was considered dangerous, sinful, something to confess. And confess they did. Confession manuals from the 13th century instructed priests to interrogate married couples. Did you touch each other with excessive fondness? Did you speak wanton words? Did you embrace while others slept nearby? It wasn't just what you did, it was where and how you did it. Guilt was assigned based not only on actions, but on setting. If the context seemed inappropriate, if someone overheard, if the room was too crowded, if the moment felt indulgent, then even marital love could become suspect. The church wasn't the only institution listening. The courts got involved too. Ecclesiastical courts handled cases of fornication, adultery, or unseemly behavior. And what was the key evidence in most cases? What people heard. In one 1442 case from Norwich, a neighbor testified that a couple lay joined after dark while the woman's mother snored nearby. Another case records a maid describing the sound of boards creaking, followed by laughter behind a hanging cloth. Homes had thin walls. Floors creaked. Nothing was truly private. Sometimes it was curiosity. Sometimes it was malice. But always someone knew. So intimacy wasn't just between two people. It never could be. It was always shadowed by judgment, by gossip, by the ever-present ear pressed to a timber wall. And yet, in all this mess, something beautiful still happened. When the candles burned out, when the noise finally gave way to sleep, when the fire dropped to embers and the cold wrapped the room like a blanket, then, sometimes, the world forgot. In that deep hush, couples found something rare. Not privacy exactly, but mercy. A hand slipping into another. A breath warming someone's shoulder. Fingers traced gently in the dark. A soft word so quiet even the mice under the floorboards couldn't hear. No one saw. No one judged. Not the priest. Not the children. Maybe not even God. These weren't grand, sweeping moments of romance. They were simple, quiet, almost invisible. And maybe that's why they mattered. A husband brushing frost from his wife's hair before kissing her fingertips. A mother reaching across the straw just to feel her partner's warmth. Small mercies. Tiny gestures that said, I see you. I choose you. Still, in those moments, love endured. Not because the world made it easy, but because people made space for it, even when there was no space to give. And things did eventually change, not all at once, but slowly, like warmth creeping in through a cold wall. By the late 16th century, privacy began to show up in floor plans. In wealthier homes, that single-room structure gave way to something new, separate chambers. One for eating, one for working, one just for sleeping. Some homes even had something called a withdrawing room, a literal space designed for retreating from company. It was a sign that people were starting to value solitude, not just for sleep, but for emotion, for intimacy, for quiet. Architecture began to reflect something more than function. It started to make room for feeling. Multi-story townhouses emerged. Bedrooms moved upstairs. Chimneys let smoke escape without filling the house. Shutters thickened. Doors began to lock. And with each wall built, intimacy breathed a little easier. Of course, for the poor, change came much slower. Rural homes remained packed. The hearth still doubled as bed and stove. But even there, small changes began to show up. Blankets hung for privacy. Beds pushed into corners. Wood screens assembled. Chimneys improved airflow. Brick replaced mud walls. Glass began to appear in windows. Bit by bit, even modest homes started giving couples the space they'd never had before. Privacy became a structure. And with that structure came a new kind of love, not the whispered kind, not the stolen moment in the dark, but love that didn't need to hide, that could exhale, that could unfold in daylight without fear of judgment. It was a shift, not just in architecture, but in intimacy itself. Love was no longer something you squeezed between chores and children. It was something the house itself made room for. Love in the medieval home wasn't convenient. It wasn't sweetly lit or sealed off with a lock. It was carved out of discomfort. It was a whispered word in the middle of chores. A glance across the table with children screaming nearby. A soft touch exchange before rising for work at dawn. They loved not because they had the perfect setting, but because they needed each other more than they needed comfort. Their love survived not by having space, but by choosing each other anyway. And that's something that still resonates. Today we can close the door. We can turn off the light. We can play soft music, light candles, mute the rest of the world. But how often do we close our hearts too? We've gained privacy, but in gaining it, have we lost something else?